A serial killer, by definition, is someone who repeatedly commits murders, following a specific pattern. Often, this repetition in the way the killer commits the crimes is more than just a method, it's a manifestation of their vanity, a mark of their identity, a unique signature. Experts describe serial killers as deeply disturbed and cruelly inhuman individuals, and throughout this text, you will discover why this is so. His occupation was taking lives, a death sentence issued by a stream and written on the stones, judged for the deaths of 30 individuals. Tiago Henrique, known as the serial killer of Goiânia in Brazil, has been detained since 2014. The youngest victim among them was only 13 years old. They were all brutally murdered at point-blank range. Recently, he made headlines again, this time for the news that he is the defendant with the longest individual sentence in Brazil. He was convicted of 30 murders, robberies, armed robberies, illegal possession of firearms, and license plate fraud, totaling a sentence of 656 years in prison. Although acquitted in 2 cases, there are still 4 pending trials. Tiago's case was marked by his psychopathic mind and actions that left entire cities in a state of panic. He showed a predilection for danger, acting without any remorse when robbing and killing. To avoid being identified by the police, he even went as far as to modify the license plates of the 2 motorcycles he used during the crimes. With the typical vanity of a calculating murderer, he claimed to have taken the lives of nearly 40 people. The day after his arrest, Tiago attempted to take his own life in the police station, using the shards of the cell's blade to cut his wrists. His behavior was characterized by extreme violence and instability, to the point of assaulting members of the press and threatening other inmates. However, a letter of remorse marked a significant change in his behavior. During the 8 months of investigation following his initial statements, he described a sensation of demonic possession that consumed him. In the letter, he reflected on the greatest challenge for anyone knowing oneself, attributing his remorse to faith. Furthermore, he modified his initial confession, claiming to have been coerced by the police into taking responsibility for all 39 murders. This change in stance raises questions about whether Tiago is truly repentant and telling the truth. Regardless of whether he is repentant or not, Tiago will face a long period in prison. Although his sentence exceeds 600 years, Brazilian law stipulates a maximum of 30 years of imprisonment. Prosecutors argued that 1 year of imprisonment for each murder attributed to Tiago falls far short of adequacy, given the extent of his crimes. In the second case, André Chikatilo was responsible for the deaths of 52 people, whose bodies were all found mutilated. During the trial, which lasted 4 months, Chikatilo had to be kept in a cage to prevent retaliation from the victims' families. Dozens of people gathered in the courts to hear directly from the killer the horrific details of his deeds, known as the Butcher of Rostov. The Russian city where the crimes occurred, Chikatilo explicitly detailed how he devoured his victims and even demonstrated, with a mannequin, how he dismembered each of them. He had the habit of approaching teenagers and young adults at stations and during train journeys. However, he would lead them away from the crowded areas and bludgeon them on the head until they were unconscious and bound. After immobilizing his victims, Andrei would commence his particular torture session. He would gouge out the eyes and tongues of the victims to prevent them from screaming, sometimes using a knife, other times his own teeth. In court, Andrei even likened himself to a wolf in a torture frenzy, deriving pleasure as his victims suffered. One of the murders that marked him was that of a 17-year-old girl named Larissa. He recalled that after she laughed at him while being threatened, he attacked her, tearing her throat, arms, and breasts with his teeth. After repeatedly stabbing his victims with a knife, Andrei often consumed their genital organs. When the torture ritual was over, he would discard the victims' clothes far from their bodies. Where did such madness come from? What happened in Andrei Chikatilo's life to turn him into a torturous and cannibalistic killer? Like many serial killers, Andrei's story began with an apparently normal life, far from any suspicion. It was a life that served as a facade to conceal the true monster residing within him, a monster fueled by traumas since the day of his birth. From a very young age, Andrei was marked by shocking discoveries. His parents found out that he would be impotent for the rest of his life, but the reasons behind this were never fully clarified. Andrei claimed in court that he was born condemned, feeling like a nature's abortion, exposing his genitalia and proclaiming his uselessness. From early on, he demonstrated sharp intelligence, but his peculiar behavior, considered somewhat effeminate for the time, was a reason for peers and family members to mistreat and humiliate him. In addition to impotence, Andrei hid the secret of a syndrome known as nocturnal enuresis, which causes a person to urinate during the night without realizing it. Even at home, he couldn't escape the abuses from his mother, Ana de Castillo. To justify the disappearance of Andrei's brother, Ana told him that the boy had been kidnapped and murdered, and that the people who did it had eaten his body. The boy grew up with this story in his head, and when he was old enough, he served mandatory 3 years in the Soviet army and then continued living in Russia, where he got married. He tried to escape from the past, and despite the problems with impotence, the couple had 2 children, which, according to the information, was only possible because he put his semen inside his wife with his fingers. It was the ghosts of his childhood and the psychological traumas that drove him to kill, and only then did he feel pleasure. He said that the stabbing motions he made on the victims' bodies mimicked the movement of penetration. As the number of victims increased, police authorities intensified their efforts to control and monitor public areas in the Rostov region. In 1990, Andrei Chikatilo was caught red-handed while attempting to attack another victim near a train station. He was sentenced to death and subsequently executed. In February 1994, Case 3 occurred, in which Pedro Alonso, known as Pedro Lopes, shocked the world by admitting to murdering 300 girls. His case gained international notoriety, being dubbed the Hatch Monster. Pedro deceived, raped, and strangled young girls as he traveled through Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. His victims were often girls living on the streets. In total, the bodies of 53 of them. He would take the girls into abandoned buildings, where he subjected them to terrible assaults. He raped them for long hours before strangling them and discarding them in isolated holes, in a scene similar to the actions of other serial killers we've discussed today. Pedro Lopes, despite a childhood marked by poverty, was not a victim of family violence, and his upbringing was considered as ordinary as anyone else's. During the testimonies, his mother, Benilda Lopes de Castanera, couldn't understand the origin of the fantastical stories told by her son about his own life. He claimed to authorities that, after running away from home, he began telling people that he was the son of a prostitute who serviced clients in front of him. Pedro left Santa Isabel, his hometown in Colombia, and traveled to Bogota. Upon arriving in the capital, Pedro joined a group of street boys to avoid the danger of being alone in an unfamiliar place. He managed to get food and temporary shelter, but soon faced sexual abuse. As a child, Pedro fled from the orphanage where he was and returned to living on the streets, where he committed his first crimes, including thefts. One of these thefts resulted in his arrest at the age of 21, and it was in jail that he committed his first murders, claiming self-defense after being abused by other inmates. This did not earn him any legal leniency, and 2 years later, Pedro was back on the streets, becoming one of the most bloodthirsty criminals in history, known as the Andes Monster. For nearly a decade, he roamed Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, targeting street girls who would hardly be noticed as missing. In 1980, Pedro made a mistake by attacking one of his victims, a middle-class girl, which drew the attention of the media and authorities. Undeterred, he continued his attacks in Peru. While approaching a girl at a street fair, Pedro caught the attention of a woman. With the help of people present at the fair, they managed to capture him and hand him over to the police. Pedro confessed to all his crimes and revealed the whereabouts of over 50 victims to the Ecuadorian authorities. Despite the number of victims, the maximum sentence for intentional homicide is 16 years. Pedro served 14 years and was then transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Colombia. In 1998, he was released from the hospital and returned home only to rob the family and flee, committing his final crime. He remained on the run until 2002 when he was recaptured and has been in prison ever since, sentenced to life imprisonment. These were the cases of 3 of the most cruel serial killers in history. Don't forget, psychopaths can be anywhere, sometimes even inside your own home or workplace, often going unnoticed. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and stay tuned for more hidden histories exposed.